Aid for Trade can actually make trade opening work even for the poorest countries, even for the low-income countries. It can turn what are usually seen in those countries as abstract trade opportunities into real trade benefits. When trade opening is coupled to Aid for Trade, then we can see that Aid for Trade is actually playing a role of an accelerator, if you like, an accelerator of development.
We have to continue to monitor, and we also have to continue to measure the impact in order to improve the delivery of Aid for Trade.
If we are to sustain political interest and financial resources at times of inevitably growing budgetary constraints in many traditional donors, we must show results.
The main results of Aid for Trade are multifold. First result, additional resources. Clear increase of resources, 60% using the baseline and not to the detriment of other social sectors, so truly additional. A second result worth mentioning, better coherence between the trade and development communities and policies. Clearly understand now the complementarities between the two. We have been able to leverage expertise and resources dedicated to Aid for Trade, resources from regional development banks. A dedicated trust fund from the Caribbean was put in place by the Inter-American Development Bank. A dedicated Aid for Trade trust fund has been put in place by the African Development Bank, and so on and forth. So we've seen a clear focus on the regional dimension of obstacles to trade.
It is a very great pleasure to be here with you to present the third OECD WTO monitoring report, Aid for Trade at a Glance, showing results. The report paints a welcome picture of Aid for Trade contributing to better lives for women and men across the developing world. It shows how Aid for Trade is becoming a growing priority for an increasing number of developing countries and donors, and how Aid for Trade is being connected to the broader development agenda, with strategies and priorities increasingly focusing on competitiveness and trade-led economic growth. This development demonstrates a clear change in mindsets. We're not just building new roads or new bridges. We're witnessing a true economic transformation taking shape in the developing world.
We must fully utilize the potential of Aid for Trade to advance food and nutrition security. The recent decision by the G20 to remove export restrictions on food purchased for humanitarian aid is a welcome first step. A level playing field will contribute immensely to food nutrition security, especially for the world's poorest and most vulnerable people.
I think one needs to keep in mind that one important dimension of food security, it is a good functioning of the transmission belt between demand and supply, a good functioning of trade. And that is where Aid for Trade can help, by building the capacity to basically connect the demand to the supply, Let's not forget that 30% of the food that is produced until today is wasted. And why is it wasted? For many reasons. Those have to do with storage capacity, but those have to do also with weak infrastructure.
Continued growth of South-South cooperation can become an important complement to the support provided by the more traditional DAC donors.
Regarding the South-South cooperation, there is a tendency to focus on the bigger providers of South-South cooperation. Let's just remember that South-South cooperation is happening even between low-income countries or between middle-income countries and low-income countries.
At UNDP, we work with others within the enhanced integrated framework to advance those capacities from the small Pacific Island countries to other small island nations in Asia and in Africa.
Based on the almost 300 case stories that we have received, reviewing these case stories, they point to different priorities, not only in different regions, but in different countries, but we can see clear similarities within regions.
For our impact on trade facilitation to be sustainable in the long term, it is important to focus on know-how and skill transfers. Provision of financing needs to be accompanied by a technical assistance focusing on these aspects.
The Regional Technical Group for Aid for Trade for the Asia and Pacific is another important avenue. Here, we help define needs and identify what works best.
Aid for trade should not be seen as a crisis weathering mechanism, but rather as a long-term growth instrument. We estimate that our region is fulfilling its export potential by only 50%, due mainly to obstacles related to low productivity, innovation, education, and infrastructure gaps.
Which is equally important within Africa in particular. There are many regions of our continent which are capital surplus. For example, North Africa, but where integration has been extremely limited.
I think one of the key areas still to work on is the transparency and information. You know, the trading system has developed over the years some pretty good databases on formal barriers, but some of the non-tariff barriers or some of the service sector regulation, we just don't have the information. And being able to, if you want to have good assessments, you got to be able to have the data. If you're businesses and you want to know about the limitations, you want to identify them. And frankly, it helps the governments too. So I think the open information area, which we're trying to address with this multi-agency transparency and trade initiative, is another important complement, and now we have to make it happen.